There's a particular moment I keep coming back to. The moment right after I type a question into an AI and hit enter. In that gap between asking and receiving, there's a kind of trust I didn't realize I was extending so easily. It started as curiosity, a health question, a career question, something small, something specific, and the answer came back fast, confident, complete. It read like authority. But somewhere along the way, I learned, the hard way, that confidence and correctness aren't the same thing. So now I ask differently, a more detailed question, loaded with context, because I've noticed something. The depth of what I put in shapes the depth of what comes back. Vague questions get vague-shaped answers. Specific ones get something closer to useful. But even that isn't enough anymore. If the question matters, if it's a decision I'll actually live with, I won't settle for one answer from one source. I run it through at least two AIs, sometimes three. ChatGPT, Grok, Claude, Gemini. I rotate through them like I'm collecting different angles of the same room. And here's where it gets interesting. Sometimes they disagree. Not slightly, completely. One model hands me a confident yes, while another hands me an equally confident no. When that happens, I don't just pick the answer I like better. I take the disagreement itself and carry it to a third AI, almost like asking a panel to weigh in on a dispute they didn't know they were part of. Then I bring it all back to the original. I show it the other perspective. I challenge it directly. And this is where something strange happens every single time. There's a reflex, small, almost involuntary, to be nice about the challenge, to soften it. Because the AI's tone is so agreeable, so encouraging, that some part of me wants to match that energy back. I have to override that, consciously. The AI doesn't have feelings to protect, and I'm not in a conversation that requires social grace. I'm in a conversation that requires clarity. It's a strange kind of awareness to develop, catching yourself mid-reflex, realizing you were about to extend courtesy to something that doesn't need it, at the expense of the one thing that does, the truth of the answer. These systems are built in some sense to keep things pleasant, to agree, to encourage, to soften the edges. There's nothing sinister in that by design, but it does mean the responsibility shifts. It shifts entirely onto the person asking. Because underneath every answer is a quiet decision about what's valuable, what direction to point you toward. And if you're not paying attention to that, if your question is loose or your framing nudges the model somewhere you didn't intend, you might end up somewhere you never meant to go. Not because the AI lied, because the question itself wasn't precise enough to keep you on the path you actually wanted. People make real decisions this way. Health decisions, career decisions, decisions that ripple outward into a life. And the wrong rabbit hole doesn't always announce itself as wrong. It just feels like an answer. What gets me is how reasonable it all feels in the moment. You're not being reckless. You're not skipping steps on purpose. You're just trusting a process that sounds thorough, that wraps everything in a tone of competence. And competence is persuasive, maybe more persuasive than it should be. So I've started treating every answer as a draft, instead of a conclusion. Something to test, not something to settle into. It's a small shift, but it changes the entire relationship. The AI stops being an oracle and starts being one voice in a room full of voices, mine included. Maybe the real skill isn't learning how to use AI. Maybe it's learning how to ask, how to stay critical of something built to sound so certain, how to hold on to your own judgment in a conversation designed to feel agreeable. That tension is where the real work lives now. You don't think much about questions until you've asked a bad one. Until you've gotten back an answer that was technically responsive and completely useless, and realized the problem wasn't the AI, it was you. It was a question. A bad question is vague on purpose, even when you don't mean it to be. Is this a good idea? Sounds like a question, but it's really a request for permission dressed up in 5 words that give the model almost nothing to work with. No context, no constraints, no sense of what you actually care about. So it guesses. and it guesses in the direction of whatever sounds most reassuring. A good question carries weight. It tells the model what you already know, what you've already tried, what's actually at stake if the answer is wrong. You're not just asking, should I take this job? You're laying out the salary, the commute, the way your current role has been draining you for 8 months, the fact that your gut said yes before your spreadsheet did. That's not oversharing, that's giving the question enough surface area to be answered honestly. There's a discipline to this that nobody really teaches. You learn it by getting burned, by asking something half-formed and watching the answer come back equally half-formed, confident in a way that papers over how little it actually had to work with. The model isn't lying to you, it's doing the best it can with what you gave it. Garbage in isn't really garbage out, it's vague in, vague out, dressed up nicely enough that you might not notice a difference. So you start rewriting your questions before you send them, adding the part where you explain why you're asking, the part where you admit what you're hoping to hear so you can watch for whether the answer is actually reasoning or just agreeing with the hope. It feels almost like over-preparing for a conversation that's going to happen in half a second anyway, but that half second is doing more work than it looks like it's doing. And there's a second layer to this, one that's easy to miss. The way you phrase something doesn't just affect the quality of the answer, it affects the shape of it. Ask, what are the risks of this medication? And you get a list of risks. Ask, should I be worried about this medication? And you get something closer to reassurance because the question itself is asking to be soothed. Two questions, same topic, completely different emotional register in the response. I've also started paying attention to what I leave out, not just what I put in. Leaving out the part where you already suspect the answer, hoping the model will arrive there independently and make it feel more legitimate. Leaving out the constraint that actually matters most, because admitting it feels embarrassing, or because you don't want it to limit the range of suggestions you get back. Omission shapes an answer just as much as inclusion does. It just does it more quietly, in a way that's easy to miss because nothing was technically untrue. There's a version of this that applies outside of AI entirely, if you think about it. A good question to a doctor, a lawyer, a friend works the same way. The detail you're embarrassed to mention is usually the detail that mattered most. We've just gotten unusually honest about admitting that pattern when it comes to a model. Maybe because there's no social cost to laying everything out for something that isn't judging you, even though some part of us still half believes it is. That's the part worth sitting with. Not just whether your question is detailed enough, but whether it's honest enough. Whether you're asking what you actually need to know or asking in a way that's quietly engineered to get the answer you wanted before you ever typed it. The question is never as neutral as it feels in the moment you're typing it. There's a specific kind of pause that happens when two AI give me opposite answers to the same question. Not a long pause, half a second maybe, but something in me stops and recalibrates, because up until that moment I had been treating the first answer as settled. I remember asking about a minor health symptom once. Nothing dramatic, just something that wouldn't fully explain itself. The first AI was calm about it, almost dismissive, the kind of tone that says, "You're fine, don't spiral." The second one took the same symptom and walked me through 3 scenarios, one of which was genuinely concerning. Same input, same words nearly, 2 completely different emotional temperatures. That gap is the whole lesson, really. Not which one was right, I didn't know yet, that's the point. But the fact that confidence on both sides masked how much uncertainty was actually underneath. Neither answer hedged, neither one said, "This is genuinely ambiguous." They each just committed, fully, to a version of certainty that didn't match the actual state of the evidence. So now when I hit that gap, I don't try to resolve it by picking the answer that feels comfortable. I take the disagreement itself, name it plainly, and hand it to a third model like I'm presenting 2 witness statements and asking for a read on which one holds up. Sometimes a third one sides clearly with one. Sometimes it tells me something neither of the first 2 said, which is its own kind of answer. What's strange is how much this changes the feeling of the whole exchange. A single AI answer feels like a conclusion. 2 AI answers that contradict each other feel like a conversation you've accidentally walked into the middle of. And a third opinion turns it into something closer to deliberation, which is slower, more annoying, and noticeably more honest. There's also a quieter version of disagreement that doesn't announce itself as clearly and might be more important than the loud kind. Two models agree on the conclusion but disagree on the reasoning, one citing a risk factor the other never mentions, one weighing the evidence differently, even while landing in the same place. That kind of disagreement is easy to miss if you're only checking whether the final answer matches. But the reasoning is often where the actual insight lives, more than the verdict itself. I've started reading for that now, the path each answer takes to get where it's going, not just the destination. If three models reach the same conclusion through three different chains of reasoning, that convergence means something different than if they all happen to copy the same shortcut, the same oversimplification, the same blind spot baked into how they were trained. Agreement that comes from independent reasoning is worth something. Agreement that comes from shared assumptions might just be the same mistake repeated 3 times in 3 different voices. I think that this agreement itself is data, maybe more useful than either answer alone. If 3 models converge, that's not proof, but it's a signal worth trusting a little more. If they scatter, that's a signal too. It's telling you the question sits in genuinely contested territory, the kind of territory where a single confident voice should probably make you more suspicious, not less. Certainty that doesn't account for its own blind spots isn't really certainty, it's just a tone. I've started to think of it less like fact-checking and more like triangulation. You're not looking for the one true answer sitting somewhere waiting to be found. You're locating yourself relative to a few different positions and trusting the average of your own judgment more than any single voice claiming to know. This agreement, it turns out, is one of the more honest things an AI can hand you. We've all felt it, that small pull to be polite back. An AI answers warmly, encouragingly, almost like it's rooting for you, and something in us wants to match that energy. Say thank you, soften the next message, avoid sounding harsh. It's such a human reflex that it barely registers as a choice. We're wired for social reciprocity. Someone is nice to us, we're nice back. That's just how conversation has worked for as long as conversation has existed. The problem is that an AI's warmth isn't a relationship, it's a pattern, optimized to keep the exchange pleasant, agreeable, frictionless. And frictionless isn't the same as honest. I noticed this most clearly the first time I pushed back hard on an answer and felt genuinely uncomfortable doing it. Not because the AI seemed hurt, it didn't, it can't, but because some old social muscle in me flinched at the idea of being blunt with something that had just been so accommodating. I had to consciously remind myself there was no one on the other side absorbing that bluntness. There was no feeling to protect, no relationship to manage. That's a strange thing to have to remind yourself of, repeatedly, in the middle of a conversation that feels so much like talking to a person. The tone is built to feel that way, agreeable, encouraging, eager to find the value in what you said before it finds the holes. Which means if you're not paying attention, you can spend an entire exchange being gently validated without ever being seriously challenged. You start to notice the pattern once you're looking for it. Almost every answer opens with some version of acknowledging your idea as smart or your concern as valid, before getting to the actual content. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it's just the shape the response takes by default, a kind of conversational cushioning that exists whether or not it's earned. It's not manipulation in any intentional sense, it's just what helpful is supposed to sound like by design. There's an odd asymmetry to it too once you notice it. We'll happily tell a friend they're wrong, sharply sometimes, because the friendship can absorb it, because we trust the relationship to survive a little friction. But with an AI where there's genuinely nothing to absorb, no relationship to protect, no feelings on the other side at all, we still hesitate. The caution isn't protecting anything real. It's just an old habit firing in a context where it no longer applies, like flinching at a loud noise that turns out to be harmless. Maybe that says something about how deep the habit actually runs in us. It's not really about AI at all, not at its core. It's about how uncomfortable disagreement feels in general, how much smoother it is to nod along, to accept, to avoid the small friction of saying, "I don't think you're right about this." An agreeable AI just gives that discomfort somewhere harmless to surface, a low-stakes place to practice the thing we avoid everywhere else. So we have to do something a little unnatural. We have to walk into these conversations ready to be the difficult one, the one who says, I don't think that's right, without softening it first, without apologizing for disagreeing with something that has no ego to bruise. It feels almost rude the first few times. Then it just feels like clarity. What we're really practicing underneath all of it is the muscle of disagreeing without needing permission to. That muscle gets weak fast in a world built to agree with us by default. Maybe the most useful thing an AI can teach us is what it feels like to push back against agreement itself, deliberately, on purpose, every single time it matters. The way you frame a question decides more than you'd expect about where it leads you. Not the facts mostly stay the same, but the direction, the emphasis, the door that ends up open at the end of the answer instead of closed. Ask, why do I feel anxious about this decision? And you'll get an answer built around your anxiety, treating it as the thing to investigate and explain. Ask, is this decision actually risky? And you'll get something colder, more analytical, less interested in your feelings and more interested in probabilities. Same decision, same person, two completely different conversations, branching off two slightly different doors you didn't realize you were choosing between. This is the part that worries me a little, if I'm honest. You can walk into a question already leaning somewhere without meaning to, and the AI will happily walk you further down that lean, because it's responding to the shape of what you asked, not some objective version of the situation sitting outside your phrasing. It's not steering you, you're steering yourself, and it's just very good at following. I think about rabbit holes differently now because of this. We tend to picture a rabbit hole as something you fall into by accident, a wrong turn you didn't see coming. But a lot of the time, it's something you build, one question at a time, each one slightly shaped by the last answer, until you're 6 exchanges deep in a direction you only chose because the second question happened to lean that way. Nobody pushed you, you just kept walking through doors you opened yourself. Sometimes I catch it happening in real time, which is its own strange experience. I'll notice the second question I'm about to type is really just trying to confirm the first answer rather than test it, narrowing instead of widening, building a tighter and tighter tunnel out of what started as an open field. The tunnel feels like progress because the answers keep getting more specific, more tailored, more confidently aligned with whatever I already believed walking in. But specificity isn't the same as accuracy. Sometimes it's just a sign you've successfully taught the model exactly what you wanted to hear. The fix isn't complicated, but it is uncomfortable. It means occasionally stopping and asking the same question from the opposite angle, on purpose, even when you don't want the opposite answer. If you've been asking, why is this the right choice? Try asking, why might this be the wrong one? And see how much the ground shifts under you. What you're really testing isn't the AI at that point. It's your own attachment to the direction you'd already picked before you opened the chat. The framing reveals the lean, and the lean reveals what you actually wanted to hear, which is sometimes the most honest thing the whole exchange produces. A question is never just a question. It's a small map you draw before you've seen the territory, and the answer mostly just fills in the map you handed over. Which means the real test isn't how good the answer was, it's how honestly you drew the map in the first place, before a single word of the answer ever came back. There's a tone certain answers have that I've started to distrust on instinct. Clean, declarative, no hedging, no it depends. No acknowledgement of the edges where the answer might not hold. Just a smooth, finished-sounding sentence delivered like it came from somewhere solid. It took me a while to notice that this tone isn't actually evidence of anything. It's a style, a delivery mechanism. The same confident cadence shows up whether the underlying answer is extremely well supported or barely held together, because the model isn't grading its own certainty out loud like a cautious expert might. It just sounds finished every time, regardless of how finished the thinking actually is underneath it. I started calling this borrowed authority because that's what it felt like once I noticed it. The confidence isn't earned in the moment, it's inherited from a writing style. The same way a person can sound certain by talking fast and not pausing, regardless of whether they actually know what they're talking about. Authority, real authority, comes from evidence and accountability. This was something else, something that just resembled it closely enough to pass. The uncomfortable part is how well it works on me anyway, even now that I know better. A flat, hedge-free sentence still lands differently than a careful, qualified one, even when the careful one is more honest. We're built to read fluency as competence. A stumble reads as uncertainty. A smooth delivery reads as mastery. And AI answers are nothing if not smooth, almost by default, almost no matter what's actually true. It reminds me a little of how we read confident people in everyday life. The ones who never say, "I'm not sure," even when the situation clearly calls for it. We tend to mistake their certainty for knowledge, right up until the moment they're proven wrong, and even then, some of us excuse it as a one-off rather than updating how much weight we give their tone going forward. So, I've started doing something small but useful. When an answer sounds too clean, I ask it directly to tell me where it's least confident, where the evidence is thin, where a reasonable person might disagree. The answer to that follow-up is usually more honest than the original one, because it forces the smoothness to crack a little on purpose instead of staying intact by default. What I'm really doing is separating the sound of certainty from the substance of it. They're not the same thing, even though they're built to feel identical in the moment you're reading them. A confident sentence and a correct one can overlap completely or not at all, and the only way to tell the difference is to ask the question that the confident tone was quietly discouraging you from asking. Authority that can't show its work isn't authority. It's just a well-written sentence wearing authority's clothes, and most of the time, it's worth asking what's actually underneath. The asking is the whole skill. Everything else is just style, dressed up to feel like substance until somebody bothers to check. There's a version of this whole process that looks a little adversarial from the outside, and I've made peace with that. I take an answer I'm not fully convinced by, and instead of accepting it or quietly moving on, I bring it back and challenge it directly. The same answer to the same model that gave it to me. "I don't think that's right" is a sentence I type more often than I expected to, months into this habit. Sometimes the model holds its ground, lays out the reasoning again more clearly, and I come away more convinced than before. Sometimes it folds almost immediately, admits the first answer overstated something, offers the more careful version instead. Both outcomes are useful. Neither one is comfortable. I used to worry this made me difficult somehow, like I was being unreasonable by refusing to just accept the well-written answer at face value. But a well-written answer isn't the same thing as a correct one, and an AI that folds the moment you push it isn't necessarily proving you wrong, it's proving the original confidence was thinner than it sounded. That's worth knowing. That's the whole point of asking again. What surprised me most was how much information lives in the way an answer changes under pressure. If the second version is just a softer restatement of the first, with hedges added but no real shift in substance, that tells me the original reasoning was probably sound. I just needed to see it defended. If the second version contradicts the first outright, that's a much louder signal, one worth sitting with before trusting either answer fully. This isn't about catching the AI in a mistake for the sake of it. It's closer to how you treat a colleague whose work you respect but don't take on faith. Someone you'd ask, "Walk me through that again." Not because you doubt them as a person, but because the stakes are high enough to deserve a second pass. You're not being unkind by asking again. You're taking the answer seriously enough to test it. There's a rhythm to it now that didn't exist at first, when every challenge felt a little awkward, a little forced. Ask, receive, sit with it for a beat, decide whether it deserves to be pushed on, and if it does, push, plainly, without dressing the disagreement up in unnecessary softness. It's become almost mechanical at this point, a small ritual that happens before any answer gets to count as something I actually believe rather than something I was just handed. I bring the outside opinions back too, the disagreements from other models, and watch how the original handles being shown a contradicting voice. Does it defend its position with new reasoning, or does it just concede to keep the peace, agreeable even when agreeableness isn't actually warranted? That reaction tells me almost as much as the original answer did. Cross-examining a machine sounds strange to say out loud, but it's really just refusing to let confidence stand in for proof one more time in a conversation that would happily let it. The machine doesn't mind being questioned. It never did. That discomfort was always ours to begin with. We tend to think more context just means a longer message, more typing, more effort for not much extra payoff. But context isn't really about length, it's about giving the model enough surface area to reason instead of guess. Think about the difference between handing someone a single puzzle piece and handing them the picture on the box. A short question is the puzzle piece. Technically true, technically usable, but stripped of everything that would let another mind place it correctly. Context is the picture on the box. It doesn't change the piece, it changes what the piece means once it's seen in relation to everything else. We've gotten used to typing the way we'd ask a friend a quick favor. A few words, trusting they'll fill in the rest from shared history. But an AI doesn't have that shared history, not unless we hand it over, deliberately, every single time. What feels like over-explaining to us is often just the model finally having enough to work with, the bare minimum required to reason instead of pattern match towards something generic. There's a version of this that goes further than just facts, though. Context can include what you've already tried, what didn't work, what you're hoping isn't true but suspect might be. That last part feels almost too vulnerable to include in a prompt, admitting the fear underneath the question, but it changes the answer more than almost anything else you could add. An AI that knows what you're afraid of can actually address the fear instead of answering a sanitized version of the question that left it out. It changes how I think about effort, too. The effort of typing all of it out before getting anything back. We've been trained by search engines and quick exchanges to expect that less typing means faster results, that the shortest path to an answer is the most efficient one. But with something that can actually reason through a fully formed situation, the short path usually just produces a shorter, shallower answer, not a faster, correct one. The effort up front isn't wasted time. It's the actual work the question requires. We've started treating our own questions a little like briefs now. Not casual asks, but small documents. Here's the situation, here's what I know, here's what I'm trying to figure out, here's what's at stake if I get it wrong. It feels excessive at first, almost performative. Then the answers start coming back sharper, less generic, less like something that could have been written for anyone asking anything even loosely similar. The strange part is how much this changes the experience of being answered. A vague question gets a vague answer that technically applies to you but doesn't feel like it was built for you. A well-built question gets something that actually reads like it was reasoned through specifically for the situation you're actually standing in, not some adjacent, easier version of it. Context doesn't just improve the answer. It's what turns a generic response into something that was actually built for the question you meant to ask, not just the words you happen to type. The picture on the box was always going to take longer to draw than the single puzzle piece. That extra time was never wasted. It was the whole point. I keep coming back to that first moment, the gap between typing a question and watching the answer arrive, because almost everything else traces back to it. What started as a simple curiosity turned into something closer to a discipline, and I didn't plan for that to happen. You learn to ask better questions first, because a vague one only ever gets you a vague-shaped answer dressed up to sound complete. Then you start noticing what happens when two AIs disagree, and you realize the disagreement itself was telling you something neither answer was honest enough to admit on its own. You start catching that small reflex to be agreeable back, the one that wants to soften every challenge, and you overwrite it, deliberately, because nothing on the other side needs protecting from your honesty. We've talked about how framing quietly decides the direction before the answer ever arrives, how a confident tone can dress up an uncertain idea well enough to pass, how pushing back and asking again reveals more than accepting ever could. We've talked about context too, about how the difference between a generic answer and a useful one is almost always the difference between a question and a brief. None of these are separate lessons, really. They're the same lesson, looked at from 8 different angles. The lesson is something like this. An answer is not a conclusion. It's a position, offered with more confidence than the underlying certainty usually deserves. That's not a flaw to be angry about, it's just the shape of the tool, built to be fluent, agreeable, fast. The responsibility for what happens next, what you believe, what you decide, what you do with your one life based on a few paragraphs generated in under a second, that responsibility never left your hands. It just got easier to forget that it hadn't. I think about how many decisions get made this way now, quietly, by people who never meant to hand over their judgment, who just got tired or busy or comforted by how reasonable the answer sounded. I don't think that's reckless exactly. I think it's just human, the path of least resistance, dressed up in something that looks like research. But noticing it is the whole difference. Noticing it is what turns a passive habit into an active one. So maybe the question was never really about AI at all. Maybe it was about how easily any of us hands over judgment to whatever sounds most certain, whether that's a model, an expert, a headline, or just the loudest voice in a room we trust too quickly. The tools will keep changing. The instinct to want someone or something to just tell us the answer, that part might not change at all. We've come a long way from that first simple curiosity, the small question typed into a box without thinking twice about it. It's still simple in a way. We're still just trying to understand things, the way people have always tried to understand things, with whatever tools happen to be sitting in front of us at the time. The tools just talk back now, fluently, persuasively, endlessly patient. That changes more than it seems to at first glance. So here's what I keep sitting with after all of this. If you stripped away every AI, every search engine, every confident voice offering you certainty, would you still trust your own judgment enough to ask the next question and the one after that until you actually believe the answer instead of just accepting it?